Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for joining me. My name is Kessler. I'm an Assistant Director for Learning Sciences and Teaching on the residential team here at MIT Open Learning. It's wonderful to have everybody here for the Festival of Learning. This event is near and dear to our heart. We put it on every year, and it's something that we just look forward to. The energy in the room, the conversations, all of that, amazing. And that's going to continue with this panel, so thank you for coming back. Today, we're going to talk about generative AI in school and work with MIT students and alumni. Please, as a sort of like housekeeping thing, if you haven't signed in already, we're going to send the clipboards around. It's a great way for us to keep in touch with you and continue the conversation beyond this room. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists today. First, we have Grace Song. Grace graduated last year with a degree in computer science with minor in brain and cognitive sciences and is currently pursuing her master's in computer science as well. Lancelot Blanchard is pursuing his master's in responsive environments at the MIT Media Lab. Joyce Yuan is a senior, graduating at the end of this year in computer science with a focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning. Rachael Harkavy is an MIT dual degree candidate in MBA Sloan School of Management and a master's in computer science and electrical engineering. And Joe Diaz is an alum. He is currently the program manager and STEM educator for K-12 at Open Learning. And then finally, our moderator for today is Ian Waitz, Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate and Graduate Education and the Jerome C. Hunsaker Professor of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT. Vice Chancellor Waitz, I hand it over to you for a great conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, super, thanks. No applause yet. We haven't said anything. It could be bad. Let me maybe start with a question for each of you as to the first time that you learned about machine learning in general, and then when you first started to learn about, hear about, and potentially yourselves use, but we're going to get to that in a moment, generative AI. So just if you can mark some dates in your history with this technology, that would be great. We'll start with you, Greg.
Sure. I think the first time I had heard the word machine learning, like it was appearing in the news, was probably when I was in high school. But I think at least my school, we didn't really have like very in-depth computer science courses. Like there was maybe one that you could take, and it was very like fundamental. It was Java-based, and we didn't really get to go into any of the more up-and-coming things. So I definitely think coming here was when I was really able to see what research can like spawn from it, what applications it can be used for. So that's kind of what got me interested in doing some UROPs that I've done in the past, and also my current MEng thesis is focused on applied machine learning to anomaly detection. So I would say that was the standard time.
You've had several classes in it as an undergrad and potentially now as a grad student.
For sure. I think they're very popular here too.
Yep. But from first hearing about it 5-6 years ago-ish.
Yes, so I let me think. I graduated high school 5 years ago, yes.
Great. Excellent.
Yeah, I think, the first time I heard about AI, I'm not sure, I think in the last 10 years, I actually did my undergraduate program at Imperial College London. So I started, it was like specialized in AI, and I think at the time it was more about AI for decision making. Just after I started, there was this, the AlphaZero work by DeepMind, so it was like kind of big boom of AI. And then I think that's kind of, I used to work in symbolic AI, so that's kind of like the more traditional AI. And I think when everything kind of, we had the first few steps of generative AI, that was kind of, wow, it can generate images in 2018 probably. And I think then the next step was then when I joined here, when kind of the GPT models started being very much mainstream and ChatGPT came out. I think that was the big boom. And now whenever people hear AI, I think they hear generative AI, they hear large language models. And I feel like it used to be more of a kind of technical, mathematical scale. Now it's kind of, you're a crypto trader if you're doing AI. I think it's like all around. So I think that's kind of like the timeline I see. So yeah, kind of big change in the last year or like last 2 years.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think the first time I remember playing a little bit with AI was like Google released this set of mini games where it's like they give you a word, you start trying to draw, or you try to draw something and the AI is trying to guess what you're drawing. It's also with like Google's Teachable Machine series of things. I think that was sometime toward the end of high school actually when they like released and we got a chance to play that. I think the real big like click in generative AI when I first saw the magic of generative AI was probably with DALL-E. I remember one of my friends got off the wait list and was being like a beta tester, and they have like that 50 free prompts you can use, and we made all sorts of random things, and that was really cool to just be able to put in a small text prompt and see that it made like somewhat coherent art that within seconds.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it would have been my intro computer science class my freshman year of college. So that was fall of 2015, and started talking about more traditional AI, whether it's classification algorithms or neural networks. I took some specialized classes in college on neural networks specifically. I was a math bio major, and so there's a lot going on there. But generative AI wasn't really in my scope until maybe this past winter with the GPT stuff coming out. And I was working in an analytics role, and we were kind of being pulled in to help our marketing team use generative AI for some of the campaigns that they were running. And so from maybe February of this past year and then coming into school in June, I felt like the world was toppled on its head since I had been an undergrad in terms of what people were using generative AI for.
Neat.
Yeah, feeling a little bit older. So I think so as an undergrad here, one of the first exposures to the idea of machine learning was hearing my course 6 friends talk about it, and I was like, oh, that's something that I'm probably not going to have to know about. But the first exposure I had was working in a group that's no longer in the Media Lab anymore, the Music Mind and Machine group, where we looked at trying to think about creating synthesizers that would take natural language and turn it into an expression of music. Now, again, that was some time ago and it didn't work out as well as we wanted. But thinking about how you could take natural language and turn it into an expression of something that people usually train and are that's very well studied to make happen was a kind of a light bulb moment. And then more recently, in thinking about machine learning and generative AI, one experience that all the tools that have been mentioned so far are really popular, but teachable machines, like you mentioned, the light bulb for me there was understanding that it was a powerful tool that could make it apparent that these technologies could be used by people who were outside of the MIT sphere or didn't work in an engineering field, where they realized they could take lots of pictures of their hands doing rock, paper, scissors and train an algorithm to predict what might happen next based on like what they did. So seeing that accessibility became a pretty big selling point for me at that point.
And when was that?
This is I guess right before COVID, sometime in 2018, 2019.
Got it.
I was in an airport.
Yeah. All right, neat. And so now many of you use these tools, and I'm going to describe it probably loosely in a technical way for research to advance other objectives, and you presumably use them also in ways that you don't have to be an expert in. Can you describe the different ways that you use the tools?
Yes, I can go first again. So I think in research, I think when especially ChatGPT first came out and it was so accessible to everyone, the year op that I was with originally, they were like, oh my gosh, we just have to try prompting it to see if maybe it can, like how well it can accomplish this task that we've been trying to do for, maybe like a year or two now. And I think at the time the task was to do some sort of abstractive summarization. So given like a conversation transcript, can you like pull like a pretty reasonable summary of what the key like highlights were in the conversation without just being like extractive. So without just like pulling like subsets of what people said, but actually trying to like write a coherent and like I guess critical summary. So that was interesting to look at. And I think the same thing now is we're trying to see if someone in my lab is trying to see if you could also do anomaly detection. So in time series, if you can kind of identify points or segments that are considered like anomalous or out of the ordinary, using GPT as well. And I think there is definitely interest there because it can also give you insight into like what UX features you might want, for example, if you want your task in the end to not just be like a demonstration of something, but also if you want to, maybe make a product or like make a package that developers interact with. And I think there's, another element of like, what usability like metrics do you want from it? So that was interesting. I took a photography class. This is pretty different, where I think that was also when DALL-E was becoming like open to everyone, at least some trial of it. So I think we spent a class where our teacher was just, helping generate images with us. And it was pretty interesting because I think one of the big conversations in the class was about, like Susan Sontag, she wrote about what the relationship is between the object that you photograph and like the object itself. And I think it's really interesting when you bring in something that's like completely like, generating things from thin air that maybe doesn't exactly belong to anybody. Maybe it's not, capturing any real thing. So I think there's definitely a lot of different areas it can touch. Yeah.
Neat.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. I think something that you point out is this, grabbing things from thin air. I feel like something that's really interesting in generative AI compared to the other tools that we used before. And I think I'm emphasizing tools because that's really the way I see it, is the fact that it's kind of a new paradigm in a way that it's a tool that also thinks, and it's not helping you do something, but it's helping you kind of conceive something and have the idea in your head. And I think there's some kind of it's similar to the relationship, where I see it as similar to the relationship you'll have with a friend during a brainstorming or during a group work, where it's kind of an idea pops out, and you're gonna take this idea and like make it into something new. So I think it's all about collaboration and the way you're gonna work with that. And I work a lot my research focuses on the music space, and but it's applicable to loads of other tools. But I feel like it's very much useful as a prototyping device where you can have those sort of ideas, or I like this sound, I like this melodic line, and I'm just going to use it and kind of transform it in a way, and then it's this conversation that kind of could echo a conversation you have with another human being, I think.
Neat.
Yeah, that sounds cool. I'm going to take the question in a slightly different direction, where I feel the strong dichotomy between using generative AI tools and then doing like AI research is when you're using the tools, everything works and it's like magic. When you're doing the research, nothing works, and no matter how you change it, nothing works. So that's what I feel like the strong difference is. It's like when I'm using generative AI, I typically use it as like a starting point to a creative process, whether it's coding, speech, or like writing stuff. And when that happens, like I feel like generally it's a pretty good starting point, and it kind of understands what I'm saying, and I can like prompt it to give me really close to what I'm thinking of. I felt this recently where when I'm trying to do machine learning research, you start the process, you wait for hours, and then nothing works. It doesn't actually turn out to be what you want it to be. So I feel like it speaks to the sensitivity of things and the black box of it still, kind of, where like when it does work, it works well, but through the process of making it work, it's still kind of hard to explain what's going on for a lot of people, for me especially. And yeah, like I think we're every day working towards like how to bridge that gap.
Yeah, I love what you said about it being a starting point. I think that's how I envision it in a lot of my schoolwork and how I'm using it as a tool. So two kind of specific business school examples. Using Claude.ai for PDF synthesis has been huge in terms of understanding, but also going back to something I've read already. So you read the case, instead of then having to read it again to find the key points that you want, using a tool like Claude to pull them out for you, explaining, I had this idea somewhere, can you tell me where it was? Can you give me the data? So kind of as this starting point. Another one has been doing interviews. So I work with a group that's the MIMO, so Machine Intelligence for Manufacturing and Operations. And we do a lot of interviews of people in the industry, and having an AI tool that can synthesize your interview notes so that you can focus on actually speaking to somebody is incredibly helpful. So if you haven't used it to help you take notes in an interview, highly recommend it.
Neat.
Yeah, I think that the direction I'll go with this is literally playing with AI. I have fun trying to put in the most ridiculous things and seeing what pops out, right? And I do this not like not intentionally as an exercise of thought, but I'm curious about what is being interpreted by what I say and what's my intended goal, and then what comes out of it as something I don't expect. So I will admit, I'm a pretty big fan of Taco Bell, just to put it out there. And the initial prompts I would put out there into the world were like, what is a sonnet about Taco Bell and how can I better appreciate it? And beyond the silliness that comes out of it, thinking about, okay, well, does it understand what a sonnet is? Is it following the rules? And as a result, I had to learn more about what a sonnet was because I thought it was silly and fun, but then I went, oh, wait, is it actually right? Do I have to think about, is it actually following the rules of syllabic construction? Is it about the thing I care about? So it becomes a whole thought exercise just because I wanted to put in something silly in the beginning.
Yes. So this is the Festival of Learning. Can you guys comment on how much of this you learned in terms of your use of these tools in classroom environments? How much just by trying and playing with them? I mean, in some ways, many of the tools have just become like word processors. You don't need to know anything of the underlying theories to be able to use them and use them effectively. So how much in classroom environments? How much just by trying it, you picked it up? And how much related to your interests in research in this area, since several of you are involved in research in this area? Maybe we'll go in the other order.
Sure. Yeah, I'll mix it up. Yeah, sure. I think that in thinking about how we use these tools, most of my work is focused on in our group working with PK-12 populations, so primary school, secondary school, not just the students but also the educators. And listen to this panel we just had where we think about the construction of the learning activity and how the classrooms are set up. One thing that comes to mind is when we're working with teachers, especially those who are already overworked and stressed and want to find ways to connect with their students. AI can be a tool in that it doesn't necessarily allow for students to cheat or plagiarize work or work in a way that limits the learning, but it can take another approach where the teacher is the learner, the educator is the learner, where they're thinking about how they're approaching their lessons by maybe freeing up time for them to think about how a lesson's created in a way that's more relevant to the students who are in the room. There's more that can be said about this, but that's part of our work and how we think about education with actual students and actual teachers.
Yeah, neat.
Yeah, this was something I was really interested in coming back to school from being in industry and being at a tech company that was actively investigating these things. Was what was the response going to be like from my peers that maybe have technical backgrounds in the master's in ECS and potentially don't at Sloan in the MBA program. And coming into the summer, I was pretty blown away by how everyone was using it. It didn't matter what your background was. It didn't matter if you were technical. Professors had already changed their homework so that we didn't have take-home finals and midterms because they didn't trust that people wouldn't be cheating. And this was only 7 months after GPT stuff came out. So I was surprised by that. And I've found throughout the last 6 months, as soon as somebody in the class figures out a way to use AI to do something, everyone knows. WhatsApp groups, emails, I'm sure the professors know as well, but it's really fast. And most of it is not technical. I've started to do some integrations on my own with APIs, and I think that is very different and not at least what Sloan is using it for, but it has been used kind of across the board.
Neat.
Yeah, I definitely think what I learn in a classroom environment in my classes is a bit different from the user experience of like ChatGPT or Copilot or one of these. I think the main difference is in my classes in deep learning, machine learning, they try to explain what goes on in the back end. And that really does help my understanding when reading the answers that I'm getting from ChatGPT or Copilot, like understanding that these answers make sense because maybe they're the statistically most common thing that people think of when they ask this question or answer this question. But I don't think I learn exactly in class, like, how do I prompt GPT to get me a better answer? I think that thing is something you kind of iterate on, almost like playing a game or getting familiar with a tool. With Copilot as well, I learned, for example, that if I just write a comment of the function that I want, or maybe like a docstring of it, like Copilot will generate that function. If I didn't do that, Copilot will not generate that function. This type of specific user thing, I don't think I learned during class, but rather experimenting by myself. But I think the classes really help me understand or make sense of what's going on so it doesn't just seem like magic and it appears.
Great.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. I think there's a few accesses on the way you can use this generative AI. There's obviously these kind of data aggregation skills, and that's kind of what we talked about. There's loads of tools that allow you to kind of perform like research, the consensus, loads of browsing tools that you can kind of ask questions that provides you a lot of papers, kind of does summary, and going back to this idea that I had of this conversation with a friend, that's kind of echoing that role that you have of asking someone that's maybe know a bit more about this. What do you think? Like I should read first, and how can I like get the main points of that? And yeah, that's definitely something that I use a lot. But to go back to Joe's point on this kind of silliness that you can use, I think something that's used a lot in the media lab is that's researched a lot, is bringing this a sense of creativity and playfulness in the way you learn things. And I think that's something that generative AI actually works really well for. There was this project in the Fluid Interfaces group, which was focused on using digital characters to teach you content, and if it's someone you admire teaching you the content, then you actually like learn it better. And I think that's very powerful. And I think we're trying to recreate this with voice models now, with speech and and music, and knowing that if Dua Lipa sings my class, like can I learn it better? And it's actually really powerful. Like if the services, there's a Cambridge-based company that's called Suno.ai that allows you to just write lyrics and will generate a song for you with those lyrics. And well, even though I've like just played with it, I think it could be very powerful for like learning. If you want to kind of have this access of this aspect of playfulness and something that's going to be personalized as well. Personalization, I think, is important. So that's maybe this better retention rates in students. I think that's an interesting aspect.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I definitely want to give a big +1 to what Joyce said about how I think learning about the architectures behind generative AI tools is really helpful for kind of helping you also understand how you can use it on your own time. But I do think ultimately the way that the classes are taught and structured can have a really big role on informing you how to best use it. So I think it's really helpful when the class puts not just like a policy on their syllabus about like, what's allowed, like what's not allowed, like what are the consequences, but I think also, giving examples of like what students can ask, so oftentimes, it's usually, it can feel like it's restricted to just what you would ask a TA in office hours in terms of like allowed like help or collaboration. But I think once you like get into a specific class, you can also, the instructor can give you a better idea of how you can also use it in other ways. So I took a databases class last year, and one thing that I was working on with my project partner was comparing how queries were executed in SQL. So like a relational database, like very traditional, versus Pandas, which is a Python package that is more used for like data science, like pre-processing for data scientists. And when we were talking to our instructor about, I guess, like how we should approach our project, they actually suggested using like generative AI to help translate between the two languages. And we were like, really? Like, we're allowed to use that? And that's really nice, thank you. So I think we definitely appreciate things like that, because I think setting boundaries and also like clarifying your learning goals can help, I think, both the students and the teachers know the best way to use the tool. So like for us, that was allowed because the ultimate goal wasn't to, the project wasn't about translating between the two languages as best as possible. It was about like looking at how you can tune the performance of each. And that wasn't something that we were using the tool to use.
So two of you mentioned this idea that knowing how, from a technical perspective, how these things work has made you a more effective user or more thoughtful user, or whatever it would be, of these generative tools. What would you say the essential? I want to get to the K-12 thing in a minute, because I'm certain that any 5-year-old can, dial up ChatGPT and use it without any background knowledge, and it will work fine, no doubt. So I want to get to that in a moment to understand where the leading edge of things is in the K-12 system. But what would you say from your perspective as recent or current higher ed students, what the essential things are that should be taught to people if they're going to use these tools, which they certainly are? What are the essential things?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with taking that. Last semester I actually took this new class, Generative AI in Education. And I felt like that's where they had some deep discussions on, like, kids are using this. What are we going to teach them to make sure they're not just like blindly trusting it? And I think what we learn in our class and what's helpful is that you have this understanding that AI is trained through data, and data includes biases. There's always ethical concerns with how we collect the data. And all of this behind it makes you realize that whatever comes out, like, it's just, in the end, like statistics, and it's not always completely right. And I feel like what we have to teach, and especially to younger kids, I guess I'm interested in the field of education, especially to younger kids, is that it's not the same as a dictionary. And it's not exactly like everything that comes out of it is the perfect truth. And I think it's hard for kids to grasp that, because it's as if someone is answering their question, most of the time answering it pretty correctly. And kids can't exactly go in and understand the math behind it either. So I feel like what we need to really focus on is helping them understand bias and AI ethics, and like kind of building that sort of guardrails into how they learn before they start using the tool.
Interesting. Other thoughts on that? Yeah.
I was actually in the same class, so had a lot of time to think about the same problems. And from a developer's perspective, what you're speaking about with guardrails is really important as well, because you can't control for all of the answers you're going to get, especially when your audience is younger children. So how do you build that into what you're creating? And again, how do you communicate that the results may not always be accurate? An example from a class I took this summer in statistics, we had a lot of people using ChatGPT to do their probability homework, and ChatGPT 3.5 at least cannot do probability. It can't. And so we had professors who were holding up work and saying, this answer doesn't make any sense. This isn't what we taught. What happened here? And so even at the postgraduate level, probability is confusing, don't get me wrong, but people are trusting tools without necessarily corroborating, even looking at your sources to say, is this how we were taught to do that? Is this what, kind of gut check the answer should be? So I think it's pervasive across education, and hopefully this next generation will maybe be taught at a younger age the uncertainty that comes with models like this, and won't be making those mistakes at 25, 26 years old.
Yeah, interesting. So now tell us where the leading edge of this is in K-12 education.
Sure.
Is it K?
Yeah, and again, I mean, there are people in the audience that are far more qualified than I am to answer all these questions. But I think that, you both make a really good point that, we want to make sure that the students who are using this, whether you're a kindergarten student or if you're a postgrad, understand the potential for things to not be as correct as they might think they are, right? If you trust these sources as an authority, whether you're a young student who thinks it's like an adult responding or not, having that built-in skepticism that also came up in the last panel is vastly important. Again, not in this official capacity, but in thinking about how you build experiences for students where they take something that they care about, that they're passionate about, and they realize how wrong something can be, such that they feel like they're the expert that goes like, something doesn't feel right here. Building those experiences where they realize that they can discern where things are not exactly correct, or where they might be less than trustworthy, I think goes a long way. And those experiences are, again, hard to put together if you don't understand where your students are coming from. So a lot of this goes back to the principles of student-centered learning and understanding who your students are as people, and then also caring about them. But building something where a student can take ownership of their learning and think about why this tool is amazing and also difficult at the same time is not an easy question to ask.
Got it.
Or answer, sorry.
Can I jump on this quickly? I think it's really interesting. I was just going to add to this. I think in the end, if you think about it, maybe the things that you need to teach is not that much. Oh, you need to fact check. What the generative AI is going to give you back as a result, but rather you need to be, if you're submitting a work, you need to kind of have ownership of your work, and you need to make sure that everything in here is accurate to the best of your knowledge. And if to kind of continue my metaphor of working with a friend, I feel like if you have a friend rather being like, oh no, but this is the answer, and trust me, and submit that answer, I think you want to teach a student as well that you might want to fact check that, and you want to not trust your friend blindly. And I think that maybe there's more of a general philosophy to have of if you're submitting something in your name and not, especially since it's harder to credit the AI rather than your friend, or blame the AI rather than blaming your friend. I think it's you kind of want to just teach in general, to take ownership and have kind of authority in what you're submitting, I think.
Yeah. Other thoughts on that?
I think I definitely really agree with what's being said here about trying to be critical about how is it trained, and what are maybe the shortcomings of the data that it's trained on, for example. I think in terms of trying to teach skills about how to best utilize this as a tool, I think a lot of it can maybe just come from what I think usually in elementary school for me, or middle school, is what they teach is critical reading or critical thinking. It's just I think that was very early on. That was when we started, I think, reading about different sources. How do you cite sources? Maybe you're in a history class and you have sources about the same event but from different perspectives, primary sources, and how there can be two different ways to write or present the same thing. I think that can be, applied to this context as well. Obviously, it's a bit harder because there's no author, I think, in whatever result you're getting usually. So, you can't really use that to kind of inform what you're reading and how you should interpret it. But I think it's the same type of skill, just being attentive about that. So I think that's kind of what is maybe being said.
How many of you have had in the last year or two both a work experience or an internship experience, anything where you're at a company outside of an academic environment? So 3 of you, yes, yeah. I was struck by the way you described the environment in Sloan, that if one person's figured out how to use it for something, instantly the whole class knows how to use it for something. What do you see in environments outside of academic environments about the rate of adoption, how these tools are being used, the extent to which people are being mindful of the things that you say are important for people to be mindful of when they use them? I'll start with you. So.
Yeah, I've done a lot of thinking about this from a tech standpoint, but also a manufacturing standpoint. And the thing that I've seen most frequently over, let's just say, the last year have been people adopting generative AI for the sake of adopting generative AI. So they have a problem, and maybe they could just run a regression model and that would give them the answer they're looking for. But instead, they're trying to integrate GPT into their data sets and protect all their PII and figure out a way to use the next best thing. So I think that's been the biggest thing I've seen, is the use case not necessarily fitting the tool people are trying to put on it, and trying to say, we're at the forefront of technology. We have generative AI doing all this stuff for us, and you're wasting resources, you're wasting money, you're wasting energy, because you're not actually answering the root of the problem. Yeah.
Got it.
I guess in both cases where I've been in, which is like big tech and like quant finance, these companies are very, very sensitive about their data. Even though they collect a lot of data, they don't want any other company to get that data. So actually both times, like ChatGPT has been banned from the companies. Yeah, you're not allowed to like put in, for example, code. You're not allowed to use Copilot with like their code base. You're not allowed to like put in their stuff into ChatGPT. I mean, Microsoft has their own, so you can use Microsoft's own like chat. Yeah, and if the companies in this area want something like that, they would buy their own model off of ChatGPT and train it.
Got it.
I think I've heard of companies that also doing deals with OpenAI, and they have some kind of like private API where there's like a promise of, we're not collecting your data.
This costs a lot, but the companies that I've worked at, they'll either choose to do this or they'll like have their own in-house one, but you're not allowed to take their stuff and put it into ChatGPT.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, the last time I worked in industry was summer 2022, so I don't think there was time yet for explicit policies about it, but I don't know, I just read about things like, oh, someone like input proprietary code and then it came out at someone else's computer, and like you definitely don't want that happening. So I'm guessing they don't encourage that right now. I think the extent to which I can maybe see it being useful is just like meta organization of your projects, like setting up like maybe things that a lot of systems would use anyway. So if you want to write like a terminal script to help like organize your files, or like generating plots, like I think that's something that can be pretty useful, and it's not like related to your like idea, or like it's not like your original work. It's just kind of helping you organize everything better, or like present things better.
Yeah. How many of you regularly write code? Make small. So 4 of you. So and do you use generative AI to help you do that? I assume you do. Yeah.
It's so helpful.
Yeah, and so. And most of your friends who code do as well, I assume? It's pretty standard. Yeah, some yes, some no.
Some people refuse to adopt, or they just believe they'll do it better, which is true for some people.
Interesting. So I just wonder how much of some of the limits within different companies are because of the particular point in time we are, and that they haven't established all the protocols and things like that to enable people to use these tools. Do you have a sense for that? I mean, since people who've been off in the tech world?
Sorry, are you asking like what protocols people have in place? Or?
Yeah, the protocols they have in place may be, I'm just thinking about your comment of just not allowing some of these tools to be used. And when you think of some tasks that it's very helpful for, whether it's summarizing documents or helping code or proofread and things like that, you would assume that for people coming out of school into companies, they will be used to having these capabilities that they can use anytime. So having companies say, no, you can't do this, I think would ultimately fail. It just seems to me.
Yeah, commenting a little on that, I think the blanket ban that was spoke about is pretty common, of companies just saying we're not using it. That being said, I don't know that means it's not being used.
Yeah.
So I think it's you can put restrictions in place that you want to put in place, but people have personal laptops, they have cell phones. If you want to do something a different way, you can. And a lot of times it saves you time. I'm kind of talking about some of my friends with consulting background who were using it to help them create slides. And they were checking on proprietary information themselves, but if they're finishing their work 6 hours faster and getting accolades for it, it's hard to then follow the policy. So I think that companies are going to be pushed in the direction of having to either create their own internal systems or allowing open source models, because someone is always going to be using it, and you're putting yourself more at risk for a data leak when people are using it on their own personal devices or off company property.
Yeah, and that's what I meant, that it seems like ultimately an absolute ban is doomed to failure. It seems to me. Just
personally, I think so, but
yeah, interesting. Where has the sort of educational system that, at least for several of you, you've been in the midst of while this sort of wave of new capability has happened, where's it really succeeded? You guys had a couple examples of things, but I want to ask you specifically, where has it succeeded and where has it fallen short?
Good question. I think I'll try to take it on in terms of the education, especially K-12 education, something I'm super interested in. I think something that I'm super excited about in generative AI is the ability to make learning accessible for a greater number of people. Just the idea that it's almost as if you have a personal tutor right next to you. So I think something that we did kind of succeed in is lowering the barrier of entry to a lot of things with generative AI through like either code or ChatGPT. Even students can ask it and get answers and kind of learn through that. I think something that is tough, which like as someone from an education research background, is there's something different from teaching versus telling. And I do think that our generative AI models like spit information, not necessarily encourage teaching or encourage like the sort of guided learning, like zone of proximal development, this type of idea that like there is a big difference between truly understanding and like learning and gaining that experience versus like lots of kids just, intake information and spew out information in a different way, not really understanding what they're saying, what they're typing, or what they actually know.
Interesting. Other thoughts on this? Where has the educational system succeeded for you, and where has it fallen short?
I guess I would say one question that will continue to come up, and as with any technology, is the question of accessibility. So if you have access to these tools, as you mentioned, you have access to these tools and you can use them in these classrooms. But when we think about access to stable internet or access to premium tools like ChatGPT-4 or any of these other things, making that accessible to folks who are in different parts of the globe who are inherently falling behind because they don't have access to them, questions of that ability to then build that familiarity and then use these tools in a way that we're all finding our way around right now is one that's also quite important.
Yeah, great comment. Any other thoughts?
Well, I was thinking of exactly what you said, of basically maybe the best way to implement those new technologies is not kind of perpetuating the same teaching methods of that we had previously of kind of communicating this information. If generative AI is going to similarly communicate this information, as you said, it might just be information dumping rather than like kind of teaching. And yeah, maybe there's a need of rethinking the way you teach those things. So obviously, like all the things that we talked about of more personalized options, more creative options of teaching this. Maybe there's a way of rethinking kind of structures of teaching rather than trying to implement generative AI in the kind of more traditional ones. So something through games, something through play, something through, as you said, like one-to-one tutoring through like generative AI. And I think something that we'll have to make sure that is implemented before we can use it properly is some kind of modeling of every student's ability, every student's preferences and backgrounds to make sure that the content is taught in a way that's like true to them and that they can remember it best. And for that, there needs to be some personalization and some memory as well, rather than just some tool that's kind of trying to put here that's kind of general and everyone can use, and maybe that's kind of bringing some learning abilities but limiting them as well.
Yeah, neat. Yeah.
I'm going to add one more small point on that, is that one thing I feel like MIT classes does really well when I came here was really encourage you to think critically. we don't really do some of the tedious rote memorization of vocabulary, but I do feel like all the P sets are hard and open-ended and theoretical. And so I feel like there's this big difference. I do feel like knowledge can be pretty like pervasive, widespread. I envision that in the future, but I feel like critical thinking is a skill that can't go away, but it's not something facilitated by generative AI.
Neat. A couple of you expressed things that I would put in the category of, let's say, hopes for 5 years from now for these tools. Are there other things that you would put in that category? Some others of you? Or?
I guess I am hoping that with other technologies we've seen as they've grown, we recall that technologies and tools like these are not meant to replace the educator or replace roles in education, but to augment, right? So thinking about how we're supporting not only students, but also educators and those who are not in formal systems to use these in a way that like facilitate that critical thinking or encourage folks to be more creative and not be so fearful that, oh, they're taking over. So that's one hope of mine.
Got it. Anything else?
Yeah, just to add on this, I think that's a very valid point, and I think it works in tandem as well in making sure those tools don't replace what we have, and also making sure that the parties that are involved do not fear this technology as taking over, because I think otherwise it's going to be a battle, and that's going to limit the adoption of those tools. So I think it's kind of a balance to reach as well, making sure that we can communicate that it does not have to be offensive or scary, but also making sure that it is not.
Great.
Yeah, I think I visited my high school maybe 1 or 2 years back, and my teachers were kind of, especially the humanities ones, they were like, oh my gosh, like this is horrible. Like all the kids are like generating their essays instead of writing them, and like we don't know what to do. And I think hopefully it can be a good opportunity for them to like change their curriculum, like change the way they do assignments, like maybe have them like debate, what they wrote, or like try to defend what they wrote or generated instead of just like turning it in, and having the teacher like read it. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for that, even though it's a challenge right now.
Yeah, going off of that, I think my hope in a similar vein is that the education system is able to transform a little bit away from maybe work for the sake of work, and instead thinking about critical thinking, critical reading, persuasive arguments, and how do you use generative AI as a tool for that? So have it generate an essay and then have the student edit it or argue for or against a point. How can you use it as a helper instead of something you're working against? And I think it is going to be a big transition, and it changes the way people think about teaching and education in a lot of settings. But hopefully the access and the accessibility is good enough that our education system is able to use it as a tool for change.
Got it. Any advice you would give to a future you, maybe a cousin, niece, nephew who's let's say just coming out of high school?
Around AI?
Yeah. or we can completely tee off. Yeah.
I think it's one thing I would say to a younger up-and-coming student is to think about that they might know more about the technologies that are available than the adults in the room often. I mean, like you can hop on TikTok or Instagram and there's whole accounts that are dedicated to look at how you can replicate your voice or generate a movie in this way. And to realize that they have a role in helping others to maybe learn about these technologies versus just being the person who's being told what to do. So realizing that they can be an educator in some ways themselves and exposing like the people that are in their lives to what exists out there.
Yeah, going off of something Grace said earlier, I would tell them to use generative AI, but understand the learning goals. So clarify with your professors what you're allowed to do, what you aren't allowed to do. Make sure you understand that, like, if the goal of the assignment is to learn how to read a book and write an essay, don't do it with ChatGPT. But if the goal of the assignment is something completely different and you just need that as background research that you're then gonna use it for something else, go ahead and use it. Learn how to use tools to your advantage. It's gonna make you more competitive in school. It's gonna make you more competitive in the workforce, but understanding that it's your responsibility for the work that you've turned in and communicating that.
Yeah, I think that's especially the case, thinking about some of the comments that have been made, that the students may know more about some of the capabilities than their teachers do at any point in time. So getting clarity on those things would be important.
Yeah, definitely agree with everything that's been said right now. I would definitely encourage my future self or my nephew to use it and take advantage of it. Besides that, I think one advice I'd probably have is to keep your eyes and ears open for new opportunity, and to the best of your extent, probably stay up to date with these things, because I do believe that it is going to be like the future, and it is advantageous or like just helpful to know what's going on. I would encourage anyone to become a power user of these tools. I feel like it's just going to help all of us along in the future, and just being at the frontier of things really gives you like perspective.
Yeah, neat.
Well, it's actually I'm drawing from a real experience, because I actually had this discussion with my cousin earlier. But I think I'm more of a very optimistic person in that direction. I think I advised him to just experiment. I feel like just playing with things is just the best way. I think I'm all about that playfulness aspect. But I think I taught myself how to code very early as a kid, and I think it was sometimes seen as like, why are you spending too much time on this computer? And I feel like trying so much and failing a lot as well, and doing things and realizing that you can't do this helps a lot. So I think making sure that there's guardrails, but just letting them use whatever they can, and failing, and sometimes maybe like realizing that they get caught for using ChatGPT, or they get like, this is obvious, and your learning outcome is minimized here, I think is very important. So I think that kind of trial and error aspect is really important.
Grace?
Yeah, I think a lot of the really good points have been said already, but I do think the starting point, like argument that whatever you use it for, it's probably the best as a starting point. I think it's helpful because I think it's true, but I also think it's encouraging that like whatever you add to it will make it much more valuable than whatever it just output for you to use. So I think that's a big one too, to encourage them. Yeah.
Anything that I haven't asked that the five of you would like to share? That we missed?
I would just say I feel really lucky to be at MIT while this like generative AI revolution is going on, and encourage anyone here, anyone in general, to take advantage of the classes and the opportunities to learn more about it, because this is like the forefront of generative AI. So it's very cool to be here and see all of this happening.
Yeah, super.
Really second that. Oh, yeah, I definitely second that in terms of like just being able to take these classes, even though I know like they're not built out yet. Like the professors, this is their first year teaching it. This is the first year technology is out. I am so grateful that they're still willing to try and experiment, or even like, bring AI bots into the class. I heard that 802 brought their own like tutor bot into the class. Just to be able to try these things. It's okay if it doesn't work out well. I'm just glad that there are people here who are willing to try and trust students to like try with them.
Yeah, super, super. Any other?
I was going to say, I think both of you make a really great point. That we're really fortunate and privileged to be here in this place. I think that also causes me to think about, don't forget to be outside the bubble, right? We're not the only ones doing this work, not the only ones that are playing with these tools. And there are a lot of perspectives coming from people who have never used generative AI that could be quite as important as we think about why we're doing this at all. So don't forget to get outside the bubble.
Yeah, great. You guys have been terrific. Thank you. It's just been really, really fun to, I guess, live vicariously a little bit through your stories of interactions with this. At least for me, it has. So just thank you for taking the time to talk with us and sharing your thoughts. And it's an awfully exciting time in this space. So I'm with you guys saying it's fun to be here at this point in time and working with these things and talking about these things. So thank you guys very much. And I'm going to hand off to Sheryl, I think. Yep.
So I get the great job of offering some final words of thanks. Thanks to Dean Capizzola and Vice Chancellor Waitz for moderating these two great panels, and to all of our panelists, the ones both the faculty instructors before and all these wonderful students and alumni. Special thanks to Jovi Nazareno and Aaron Kessler for all the heavy lifting to get today done. Yeah, can we do a little for them? Thank you so much to all of you for being here. It really wouldn't be that fun if it was just me and Aaron and Jovi, although they are awesome. But again, if you haven't signed on the clipboard, we'd love to stay in touch. That's the way to do it, or buttonhole one of us and tell us who you are if we don't already know you. And last but not least, lunch. So just follow the crowd across the hall, grab your lunchbox. If you need to take it on the run, you're welcome to do that, but we hope that you'll stick around. We have this event in this space, so there's lots of places to sit with a new friend or an old colleague in Student Street. Check out the tables of the residential staff that are out there, and hope you have the great rest of your day. Thank you for coming.